We all know someone, or may be that person, who is always trying to optimize your workouts. And because of this, people will often end up with this huge cabinet full of expensive supplements that may or may not be working. And as a naturopathic doctor, I see a lot of these people. And I would argue a lot of those products are a waste of your money. So I wanted to spend today to talk about the workout supplements that actually help with things like endurance and your strength training. My name is Dr. Robin Lewis. I'm a naturopathic physician practicing here in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And yes, today I want to talk to you about the best workout supplements. I also think it's worth mentioning that these supplements are not just for those gym bros, the super fit and elite. In fact, I would argue that it would be in all of our best interest to focus on optimizing our workouts and preserving muscle mass. Because as we age, we will undergo cellular and molecular changes that make us more resistant to these physical exercises that normally would promote really good exercise performance, muscle mass preservation, and things like that. They actually studied this, and around 30, we start to lose muscle mass at a rate of about 3 to 8% per decade. So anything we can do to kind of slow that down is extremely beneficial because preserving muscles is really important. Yes, aesthetically, sure. Also for fall prevention, our muscles are sponges for excess sugar. It keeps us metabolically healthy. It's really, really important as we age. So these supplements, yes, are used a lot in the gym community, but they might be helpful and might be beneficial for some of the just gen pop who are just looking to make the most out of their exercise. So in today's episode, I'm going to focus only on the ingredients that actually make a difference. And to start out with, I'm going to talk about the number one most studied ingredient that I think at this point is indisputably beneficial for most people. And that is creatine. So creatine's been on the market since the 90s. It's been studied for a very, very long time. So it's no debate really online whether or not this is a useful supplement. But what I do want to do for you is tell you exactly how it's useful because it's not useful for every single type of exercise and how to take it. So if we start to look at something like resistance training, when they look at review studies, they have found that an overwhelming 70% of those studies show a positive impact on building muscle and strength. Now that for a supplement is a very big deal. If we look at things a little closer, creatine really seems to shine when it's being used for short duration, high intensity resistance exercise. And then when you look at the studies in regards to endurance sports like swimming, for example, the research is far less impressive. So this really is most useful in the context of resistance training. So strength training at the gym, lifting weights, things like that. There's very good research behind improving our ability to lift more, fatigue less quickly, and grow muscles quicker. They believe this to be the case because these short duration, high intensity reps rely heavily on the phosphocreatine shuttle to replenish our ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. So I'm just going to briefly go over the mechanism because A, I think it's super cool, and B, I find people are far more compliant with something if they understand why it's beneficial for them. So if we go back to the shuttle that I was just referring to, this phosphocreatine shuttle is what's used to replenish ATP. So if you look at this diagram, the phosphocreatine is donating a phosphate group to recuperate ATP. ATP is our main energy source in our muscles, in all of our cells realistically, but we're talking about muscles. So ATP needs to be burned for energy to fuel us so that we can lift and do all of these things that require a lot of energy. And so they believe the phosphocreatine shuttle that helps replenish this is one of the main reasons why creatine is helpful, because taking a creatine supplement can increase our muscular phosphocreatine levels. Now, to get a little bit more specific, it has been shown to increase those muscular levels by about 10 to 40%. Now, this is going to vary a lot because some people start out with higher stores than others, and unfortunately, there's no real way of testing this. But either way, if you take creatine long enough, you're going to saturate those muscles and they're going to hit max capacity regardless. And so that leads me to my next point, which is whether or not to load creatine. So back in the day, they very much emphasized loading your creatine, which essentially means taking a higher amount of creatine over a short amount of time to saturate that muscle quickly so you build up your stores a lot faster. The issue is that comes with a lot of the side effects of creatine. So the main side effects would be things like increased water retention, so you might feel more bloated and puffy. You can get gastric upset. And when I say something like gastric upset, I'm talking about an upset tummy. So things to do with your digestive system. And realistically, for a lot of people, this isn't necessary unless you have to perform well at a sport, for example, in a short amount of time. Like you don't have the time to build those stores up. You need to have high levels of creatine in your muscles quickly. That would be the only real justification for the loading because eventually you will get there regardless. So if you just take your normal dose, which is typically around 5 grams a day, within the matter of like maybe 2-3 weeks, you will saturate that muscle regardless, and you didn't need to load it to do so. So unless you're on a really shortened and condensed timeline, you probably don't need to suffer through the consequences in order to saturate the muscle. Now, there are also some concerns online about these creatine supplements increasing something called DHT, which is our most androgenic form of testosterone. It's linked a lot to the male pattern hair loss, or in females, it's linked a lot to hair on your chin, some of these more male characteristics, acne on the body, things like that. But unless you're getting those symptoms, I'd argue this isn't really happening for the majority of the population, and there's very few studies that show that it actually does this. So I would take it with a pinch of salt for most people. It's not like it's gonna start throwing hair on your chin right away. But if it does, then of course that would be a reason to come off of the creatine. Now, if we circle just quickly back to the dosing, if you want to get super nuanced about it, they do say around 3 to 5 grams a day for someone less than 180, and around 5 to 10 grams if you are heavier than 180 pounds. But for a lot of people, they're just going to stick to that standard 5 grams a day. And for most people, that is very well tolerated and does lead to these significant changes in their workout performance. Now, if you were to do the loading, typically what they're recommending is 0.3 grams per kilogram per day. Now, if you were to do the loading, typically what they're recommending is 0.3 grams per kilogram per day for up to 7 days. That's the loading phase. And then you drop back down to a maintenance dose of around 5 grams a day after that. Now, to put that into context, for someone who's 180 pounds, that's almost 25 grams of creatine a day. So as you can see, the dose is a lot higher and therefore a lot more potential for side effects with that. So that's a big reason why a lot of people won't bother with the loading phase, but ultimately it's personal preference and entirely up to you. So that's the 101 on creatine. Now let's move on to the second favorite here, and that is caffeine. So caffeine in many different forms, but surprisingly enough, it actually does make quite a big difference if we look at the research. Now, before we get into the benefits of caffeine, I do need to note that not everyone tolerates caffeine very well. And a lot of this has to do with how you metabolize and how your liver processes caffeine. And so if you are the type of person who does tend to get more anxious and have your sleep affected by caffeine, then I would argue the cons definitely outweigh the pros when it comes to overall health and performance. But if you are one of those lucky individuals who does tolerate caffeine fairly well, then this is probably a good option for you. Now, Similar to creatine, it has a lot of research on resistance training. More specifically, it has been shown to increase the amount of reps per set. So of course, if you can lift more, you are likely to grow quicker if you're looking to achieve muscle hypertrophy. The other thing that's really interesting is it also seems to improve the velocity at which you move those weights and also reaction time. So this has more of a implication when it comes to sports, when you have to move quickly and react quickly. So caffeine does seem to enhance that as well, which is really cool. If we start to talk about caffeine in the context of cardio, they had one study where it looked at the combination of creatine, caffeine, and branched chain amino acids, and they found that people taking these supplements over time had improvements in their VO2 max. So for those of you who don't know what VO2 max is, please go back and watch my video on Zone 5 training where I really dive into it. But in a nutshell, it's the amount of oxygen you can take in to fuel your muscles. So of course, if we can take in more oxygen, we have more fuel available for us, and so we can work out at these higher intensities for longer, and especially in the capacity of things like sprinting and HIIT training and stuff like that. Another meta-analysis that looked at just caffeine alone did find a small but significant impact on endurance training based on 46 different studies that they looked at in people taking a moderate dose of caffeine. So then this really begs the question of what is a moderate dose of caffeine? What do you realistically have to take in order to realize these benefits? So they will typically classify a moderate dose to be 3 to 6 grams per kilogram of weight. So to put this into some context, I, for example, typically weigh in around 60 kilograms. And so for me, that would mean I'd have to take around 180 to 360 milligrams of caffeine before I work out to realize the benefits. Now, if we look at the average amount of caffeine in, say, a pre-workout, it's typically around 150 to 300 milligrams. So in this case, that would be an adequate amount based on the research. Now, if we look at the context of if you want to take it in the form of coffee, an average cup of coffee typically runs around 100 milligrams. So I'd have to take around 2 cups of coffee before I work out or take a scoop of pre-workout. So I find that really helps put it into context because when you measure it in cups of coffee, most people are used to having caffeine in the form of coffee. And for a lot of people, 2 cups of coffee before a workout would seem like an excessive amount of caffeine. And certainly for a lot of people, that would give them anxiety. It would impact their sleep, especially if they're working out later in the day. So again, you really do need to be careful with the caffeine because the dose in which you need to take in order to have these benefits on resistance training or endurance training is quite high. And so for a lot of people, this is just not a realistic supplement. If you're like myself and you can drink lots of coffee and not have those effects, then maybe caffeine's a good option for you. The third thing I want to mention is a category of supplements, and these are the ones geared towards improving nitric oxide production. And for those of you who don't know what nitric oxide is, it is a vasodilator. So the reason a lot of people believe these supplements to be beneficial is because they will improve blood flow to the muscle, which could mean improved delivery of oxygen and nutrients, and improved removal of waste like lactic acid that builds up as we exercise. So in theory, it makes a ton of sense. In actuality, it really doesn't seem to be as helpful as you would assume. Citrulline does seem to work better than arginine. I will say the research there is pretty decent. But one interesting thing I found is that these nitric oxide boosters seem to be less helpful the more fit you are. So there's good research for people who are just getting started, and for a lot of people, if there's a lot of fatigue and resistance to exercise, these products might be super helpful for you. But the benefits seem to dwindle out with time. The more fit you get, they don't seem to work as well. And citrulline also has another mechanism in which it might be helpful, and that has to do with the urea cycle. So I think that might have a lot to do with why citrulline performs a bit better than the arginine. I don't think it's fully explained by blood flow, but either way, if you're gonna take these products, I would go for a citrulline. And if you're super fit already, you might not notice a huge difference. As far as the dosing of citrulline goes, the average is around 2 to 15 grams 1 hour before exercise. Most people are taking around 8 grams 1 hour before exercise. So if you're going to take it, that's roughly how much you want to take. The next thing that I want to talk about is minerals as a whole. So I know that things like electrolytes have become super popular. Minerals is a pretty big category. There's lots of different types of minerals. So I'm just going to focus on the ones that actually seem to make the biggest difference because there is good research, but certainly not for just all minerals as a whole. The two main ones that have really good research behind them are iron and magnesium. So now for iron, it's pretty interesting because it very much depends on where you start out. So what I mean by that is if you're deficient in iron, you're going to notice a big difference when you take iron on exercise performance. But if you're not deficient in iron, those benefits aren't really there. And so iron deficiencies are certainly very, very common in the female population. And I would argue there's a lot of misrepresentation of what iron deficiency even is. So if you look at the reference range for iron, it's typically below 15 micrograms a liter, then you're deficient. I would argue you can be symptomatic of low iron below 50. So there's a lot of confusion around what is considered too low. But either way, if you're below 50 micrograms per liter, you might notice a benefit from taking an iron. And what they also say in the literature is it very much depends on how much you take, how you take it, and what your starting levels are. And that might sound really obvious to you, but I don't think a lot of people think about it this way when they talk about supplements as a whole. And I think this applies to a lot of the minerals. It's not so much that they aren't beneficial, it very much just depends on where you started out to begin with. What are the minerals that you're more likely to be deficient in? Those are the ones that tend to have the best research on them. So if it's an unlikely deficiency, it's also unlikely to have an impact on your exercise. So then that brings me to magnesium, because magnesium is also a very common deficiency, especially in healthy individuals. So not just females, but males and females. And the reason for this is around 35 to 75% of the population isn't getting enough magnesium in the diet. Part of this might have to do with how our soils are very deficient in magnesium, but either way, a lot of us aren't even getting enough in the diet alone. And then if you talk about exercise and being more active, people tend to burn through more magnesium the more active they are. And so it's one of those deficiencies that's actually really common in healthy individuals. Of course, a lot of deficiencies can happen if you eat a really crummy diet, but the magnesium deficiencies can be there even if you are eating a whole food diet full of foods that should theoretically give you magnesium. It's because you're burning through that magnesium. So I won't spend too much time here because I did dedicate an entire episode to the nuances of dosing magnesium, but in the research, they typically find around 300 to 500 milligrams is where you're going to notice a benefit. And magnesium is also interesting because it can be used for functional measurements of the muscle performance, so things like your 1 rep max, but it's also really helpful for the recovery portion. So how well your muscles relax after exercise, how much tension do you have in those muscles, the inflammation that is created by working out. Those are other areas that magnesium can be super helpful for, unlike a lot of these ones which aren't as geared towards recovery. And now lastly, if we talk about the electrolytes, which are typically really high in sodium chloride and potassium, those ones are particularly helpful only if you are doing something that causes an excessive amount of sweating. So this would be things like hot yoga, for example, or really intense cardio where you are sweating a lot. Because of that, you are losing some of your minerals in your sweat, being namely the sodium chloride, because that's the highest percentage of minerals in our bloodstream. And so you will lose a disproportionately large amount of those particular minerals that are again found in these electrolytes like LMNT or the Noon tablets, for example. So those supplements are helpful on the days of workout where you sweat a ton because you're just replenishing something that you're losing more of. Do they have a ton of good research otherwise? Not really. So that's the highlight on minerals. Is there's certain minerals that are more helpful for certain individuals. You do really need to take into the context of what you're doing as exercise in order to know whether or not this is helpful for you. And those are the big ones. Like there's a lot of talk around things like branched chain amino acids and some of these other supplements that are really helpful for mitochondria and stuff like that. But the evidence just isn't there. So it's not to say that I haven't left out a few things that might have decent research, but these are the ones with the best. So I hope that you found today's episode helpful. I hope this helped clarify for you which ones are worth your time, whether you want to go for some of these really fancy, complicated formulas. I'd argue a lot of those ingredients are probably not super helpful. But either way, I hope this helped you. I hope that you go into your workouts now with a little bit more confidence that if you are taking some of these things, it is making a difference. And if you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Thank you so much.